Hello, everyone. This is the Deadly Analysis Podcast. I am Garrett, and I'm here with Shayra, Antonio, and Jim. And today we're going to be talking about the 2006 film Bug, directed by William Friedkin. And I'm getting echo feedback. Sorry, hang on. There you go. Fix that. Directed by William Friedkin, starring Ashley Judd, Harry Connick Jr., and Michael Shannon. This is the first film for the Deadly Analysis that I was actually a choice of mine. I've been doing this podcast now for over a year, talked about many films, so I'm really glad that we get to do one that I picked. This film is not only one of my favorite horror movies, it's one of my favorite movies, period. I love it for a multitude of reasons, which we will be getting into in the discussion today. So before I sort of fan gush all over the place about how awesome this movie is, I sort of want to open up the floor and sort of give any sort of give my other co-hosts here any sort of initial impressions that they want to share, any off-the-cuff thoughts or general ideas about this film. Take it away, guys.
I just want to throw out there that I think there was a missed opportunity on this movie when you have Harry Connick Jr. in a film and it's about bugs and they're not singing, "I got you under my skin." I think it would have been so perfect, but I dig a lot of it. I do want to go into all of the different elements I liked, but I would have loved if they would have done that.
Yeah, Harry Connick Jr. I think is an underrated actor. He gets lots of play and attention for his musical abilities, which he sometimes brings to the big screen. But I think he's fantastic in this, truly, and it shows I think what an underappreciated actor he is.
Yeah, and he's playing a really complicated role here. I think that's one of the things I like the most about this film is that all of the characters have complexity to them, including Jerry Goss, the abusive husband who is also suspicious of the psychopath, or rather the person who has a paranoid tendencies, certainly. So I think it's really interesting that he's playing this really complicated role, and I think you're right, Garrett, that he doesn't get enough credit for his acting chops, so to speak. So
yeah, for me, honestly, the takeaway that I had from the movie, the biggest initial impression I walked away with was this is a fantastic. The thing I liked best about the movie, honestly, even more than the plot and stuff, which were all very interesting, is this is a movie just on production level that has like 7 people as the cast, incredibly shoestring budget. This is an example of using your resources in a really creative and efficient manner more than anything else. The storytelling is really well done. The camera work is really well done. The sets are very well put together and very believable. I was reading about how they set up that aluminum foil room and the insane things they had to do to keep it from reflecting the cameraman and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a tightly shot movie. It's a great example of working within the constraints that are given to you and producing something that is very well crafted. I would contrast this movie, for example, with something like The Hobbit as on the other end of the spectrum, where you just have so much money thrown at a movie, so many people thrown at a movie that it just completely goes out of control and you end up with a complete mess. And then you have something like this, which was probably done with literally 1% of the resources of something like The Hobbit, that is 150 times more tightly crafted.
I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was based upon a play by Tracy Letts, and it had a significant theatrical run. Michael Shannon is actually reprising the role that he reprising the role in the film that he originated on stage. And on stage, it's Tracy Letts is a renowned playwright. He got his big breakout hit with August Osage County, but this and Killer Joe previous to it are examples of just how good Tracy Letts is as a writer. Now he's getting a lot of fame as an actor. With a couple of high-profile films, he worked in The Post, for example. But going back to his roots as a writer, this is an example of just how good he can be and how good he is with characters and morally iffy characters. Agnes is a problematic character. RC, everybody in this in this film is a little seedy, a little off, a little morally ambiguous, and it makes it hard to. It seems like they're creating a world in which everybody is untrustworthy, and I like how the film is able to make us feel for these characters, even though they are so morally ambiguous.
On the other hand, though, to go back to the production for just a second, while I think that you definitely have a really good point in that the tightness, the economic tightness of the movie is very much related to its previous life as a play, most stage adaptations feel like stage adaptations, and this one really didn't. They really took pains to visually craft it in a way where, even though you actually, if you think about it, it pretty much, it tracks the play very closely. You know, it's like it's shot in like 3 locations. The cameras don't move around a whole lot. There's like 7 characters, etc. It has a lot of play-like elements, but they're crafted in a way that pops out that third dimension that you're looking for in cinema.
So yeah, I think a lot of that, of course, has to do with with William Friedkin being behind the camera. I mean, Friedkin, of course, famous for directing The Exorcist, one of the most famous horror movies of all time. And I think that you can sort of see his hand. There's I think a lot of clear stylistic similarities between The Exorcist and this film. And while The Exorcist obviously gets a lot more attention than Bug does, I think that's that's in some ways a criminal offense, because honestly, I think I would rate this film above The Exorcist in terms of just overall quality. But maybe that's a discussion for another time. But I would like to say, I suppose it's probably a good idea to briefly summarize the general narrative thrust of the film, in case anyone's watching who hasn't seen it. I'll try to do it in a way that doesn't spoil anything. But if you have not seen the film, the basic gist is that Ashley Judd and Michael Shannon are 2 lonely, isolated people who sort of find each other and develop an awkward friendship. Harry Connick Jr. Plays Ashley Judd's estranged husband, who is abusive, but also sort of concerned about this loner of Michael Shannon, who's comes in and sort of is moving in on his woman, and the friendship develops in a way that, shall we say, it becomes mentally unhealthy for both of them. At bottom line, I think it's fair to say this is a film about paranoid schizophrenia and how it actually can be contagious, and how when you are lonely and isolated and the only person around you or only people around you have delusions, that those delusions can be more important than the reality that you live in. And it's one of those, I think, rare films that does a fantastic job of exploring mental illness in a way that's maybe not necessarily clinically 100% accurate, but deeply, deeply disturbing and quite terrifying. So with that sort of general sort of narrative thrust summary and a few of the key players on board, I guess I'll come back quickly to Michael Shannon. This is the first film I ever saw Michael Shannon in. It was my first exposure to him. I'd never seen him before as an actor. Obviously now he's gone on to considerable acclaim in other films, but really this, I mean, he is just so, I mean, Jim, you said he's complex. All the characters are complex. And yeah, because on the one hand, he's sympathetic and you care for him. But on the other hand, he's clearly deeply disturbed and he's dangerous. And it's hard to know exactly, how to sort of reconcile your own conflicting emotions about him and indeed about all of these characters. And that incredible emotional complexity is in a lot of ways what keeps this film afloat for me.
I have family members that remind me very much of Peter's character. It's kind of reminded me of Alex Jones, honestly, a lot of the rhetoric that he started spouting off, but obviously that's why some of my family members sound like that, because they listen to Alex Jones. So, but that's exactly the point of this film, and it was kind of sad for me to watch, more so than scary, because I was like, this is exactly how they got indoctrinated in these viewpoints. They hear someone spouting off some slight truths and skewing it in a way, because they're not educated enough to be able to research it for themselves, skewing it in a way that they can tell them that the government's watching you or listening to your conversations or implanting bugs in you or whatever. But it's sad, because this is accurate to what actually is occurring right now in America. Like, this is literally what a lot of these radio show hosts are doing to people. who are isolated people. These are generally isolated people. All they engage in is these radio shows to get their news. So,
and it's kind of, the film is kind of a microcosm of that in so many ways, because, you know, again, there's several scenes basically where sort of Peter says to Agnes, look, you know, you don't have to believe this. I'll just go. You know, just, you know, if you think I'm crazy, I don't want to be here if I'm not welcome. And the thought of being left alone again is so terrifying for Agnes that she actually is willing to suspend her own understanding of reality in order to stay connected to somebody. And that's, like, again, in so many ways, like what I think a lot of people who are out there in these sort of, you know, fringe communities are like, is, you know, they're like, again, they're lonely. They don't have a lot of friends. The only real friends they have are people they meet through Alex Jones or whomever. And the thought of losing that friendship, of losing that minimal social support that they have, is so terrifying that they are willing to suspend their better judgment in order to stay connected to people. And it's hard for a person, again, like myself, I think, who has a fairly healthy social network and people with, you know, diverse viewpoints and so forth, to be able to really understand how terrifying that can be, to lose your only friend, to the point where it might actually be worth sacrificing your understanding of reality and even your own sanity in order to hold on to that one friend.
That's one of the things that's an interesting part of the whole descent, so to speak, that Agnes goes through and that Peter goes through with her, because, you know, Peter starts out as a relatively, on the surface, he looks like he has enough shit together. Like he looks like he's, you know, fairly normal. I mean, that's one of the questions that I directing questions that I would have for William Friedkin is, you know, is it a deliberate choice to make Peter slightly off, or is it an even stronger choice to have Peter come on the screen and immediately be completely charming? It is sort of an interesting question that I'm sure they had to wrestle with at one stage. But one of the things you sort of keyed me into was when, and this is spoilery, we will probably, to new viewers, sometimes we do get into some spoilers at the end here. When Agnes is going on her super mother bug rant, the rant that culminates in her declaring herself super mother bug, is he keeps saying, okay, now get another piece, now get another piece, so that he is getting her to create the reality with him, that he's not inflicting his reality upon her, but rather together they are creating this delusional sense of this delusional reality that, of course, leads to what happens at the end. I think that's an important point, even as Peter, and one of the questions I have for the rest of you as well, and then I wrestle with as I look at this film, is to what degree, like, when is Peter ever being deliberately manipulative? Now, I think there are a few points when he is, but I think there are several points in which Peter is just genuinely sharing the thing that he believes with RC and Agnes, and with Goss to a lesser extent. To what extent is this his genuine fear, and to what extent is he fucking with them? I guess that's, go ahead.
Before we get to that, I think the much more interesting discussion, well, I don't know about much more interesting, but more interesting discussion is how do we know they're delusional?
I think the film is relatively clear that they are. Oh, okay, so
yes, lay out for me the case where the possibility that they're not delusional is falsified.
There are no helicopters around. We never see any helicopters except in when we're in their reality. So that's
sad. But we do hear the bugs buzzing and zapping in the bug zappers.
Yeah, but we never actually see the bugs either. It's not just that we don't see the helicopters. We never actually see a bug.
Yes, we never see helicopters. We never see bugs. On the other hand, a dude does show up who's clearly looking for Peter. And from the way that he talks, unless we're meant to infer an unreliable narrator perspective, which the movie never cues us into in any way, What he says seems to indicate that that something was done to Peter that he wants to cut out, to reverse. He seems to play along with the narrative that Peter presents. And then, of course, the other aspect of that is in the credits of the movie, there are two scenes shown in juxtaposition to each other, which both, again, cast further doubt on the reality of what we've just experienced. So I don't know. I came away with the movie thinking that the director intended for it to be completely ambiguous, whether they were nuts or whether they were actually in on this elaborate conspiracy theory. I did not get the impression that the director wanted us to conclude ultimately that they were delusional. There was too much ambiguity thrown in there. Is that just my take, or have some of you come away with that as well?
I actually had the same. We had a long discussion about that, like what's going on here, because it's pretty obvious to me that they're on the level of aliens, you know, these conspiracy theory types. But this doctor did come in and start spouting off stuff, but was he doing it to manipulate her because he was trying to get them to go to help and lying to them to get them to get the help that they need? Or was he obviously wasn't a robot. I mean, he was bleeding out, unless, you know, the robots bleed out. It seemed like he was a human once he got stabbed. And he was like, look, you know, he's not a person. And she was like, yeah, he is. Like, but she still went with it. I don't know why. It was, it's really tough because they make it go back and forth. I mean, he did say that her child is still around and that he can get her to access her child again. And I can't think of any doctor who would actively go to somebody's house and lie in that way. I don't know if that's a common practice with doctors.
Also used the name of her son.
Yeah.
She never mentioned it.
Right. So I mean, look, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I don't, you know, but there are two things that doctor does that makes me think that either A, he's not a doctor, or B, he's a really shitty doctor. And the first one he does is like freebase. I don't think there are many doctors who use the drugs that their patients are on in order to connect with them more.
And not even question if there might be angel dust like laced in it or something crazy. Like he's just like, can I have some of this? Like,
I think that goes to the point of suggesting that he's not actually like a doctor in an actual clinic or something, but a much more sinister agent of, you know, some shadowy power who gives very few fucks, and that's why he feels presumptuous enough to sort of barge in and smoke somebody's pipe. Just to sort of contextualize this a little bit, by the way, have any of you guys seen the Mel Gibson movie Conspiracy Theory? Because there's a lot of similar themes and sort of and that same sort of like, is he paranoid or is all this crazy shit really true kind of juxtaposition that I thought came out very strongly in this movie.
Yeah, Jim, I want to hear what the second thing is here in just a sec, but I also want to answer Antonio's question there from earlier before we get too far from it. I didn't feel the film was ambiguous at all, but I think it's fascinating that you do, and I think like, well, great films, when there's multiple interpretations, it makes it much more interesting. But the way I would sort of square the things you're pointing to is clearly something has happened to Peter in the past. He's been in an institution. He probably really served in the military. Maybe they really did perform some sort of experiment on him. Something like that is almost certainly true of his past. But because of his fragile mental state, he has built on these horrid experiences and extrapolated all this other stuff. So everything about the bugs and, of course, about the machine and so forth, all that is just a figment of his imagination. So he's not completely crazy in the sense that some of the stuff he says about his own past is likely very true, but it's also almost certainly highly embellished and exaggerated well past the point of reality. So that's my thoughts on the whether or not he's crazy. Jim, I wanted to pass it back to you to say, what's the other thing that Dr. Sweet does that makes you think he's not really a doctor?
Buys into the delusions of his patients. I was a paramedic for 2 years, and they taught us sort of rudimentary dealing with mental health crises. And the #1 rule was never buy into the delusions of your patients. If they say that there are bugs, you don't go, oh yeah, I see one. That's like rule number one. And the idea that this doctor does that immediately discredits him either as a doctor or as a good doctor. So those are the two things that make me find him to be unreliable. I've got a larger sort of theory about Dr. Sweet's involvement in this that I'll be happy to share with you. But I wanted to like sort of throw it back to you, Antonio, before, since I'm sort of disagreeing with you, I want to give you a chance to respond before I go into a larger discussion about that issue.
Oh no, you can pretty much go ahead. There's not. I mean, I think that you can validly interpret the movie as them just being nuts. I also think that you can validly interpret the movie, particularly given the shots intercut in the end credits. You can validly interpret the movie as a fantasy, probably, and you can also, and I think you can also interpret it as a sort of like conspiracy theory type idea where some or a substantial majority of the crazy allegations made are actually in some way correct. But yeah, you know, I definitely some of the points that led me in the direction of thinking that it might be plausible that they weren't nuts is, you know, he knows the son's name. We see his body unburned after the end of the movie. You hear bugs in the zappers. There's kind of like a weird scene after he pulls the tooth and they look through the microscope at the tooth, and he says, "Oh, there's millions of them." And then she looks and immediately sees the exact same thing that he sees. And then the camera immediately cuts to a shot that looks like it's under a microscope of like a bunch of shit moving around really fast. And so it's sort of implied that this is what they see. And so again, it could be simply a completely subjective story from beginning to end where it seems really real to them, but they're just completely crazy the whole time. But I think there's also a hint of potential plausibility to it. It does seem kind of nuts, obviously, but that's what makes it so interesting is it seems so nuts, but they put so many little elements of plausibility in it that you're kind of like, huh. And that's why I brought up the Mel Gibson movie Conspiracy Theory earlier, is because that is one that unambiguously concludes in favor of all the crazy shit being true. But it strings you along for about 85–90% of the movie where thing builds upon thing, and you just increasingly think to yourself, Mel Gibson is just fucking crazy. And then at the end, at the very, very end, it's like, nope, it was all actually true the whole time.
And that could be based off of the whole MK Ultra thing. Everybody thought that was a crazy conspiracy theory, and then once it was proven to be true, you know, it was like, oh, okay, we might need to be a little bit more flexible on what we call bullshit, because sometimes, you know, the truth is actually weirder than fiction. And so it is something to keep open-minded about. And obviously, as people who tend to question in everything but still watch horror movies, that's literally what we do. So this is kind of a great film because it makes us question, wait, is this really happening? Is this not? Like, what's going on? How is this supposed to be taken? And like, even just the introduction of Peter, you see him and you're like, he seems like a nice guy, but the camera angles are telling me something else is going on with this character. So you're always questioning him and not trusting him. They even bring that up in the dialogue, though. You know, like, oh, do you even trust me? No, I don't. I certainly don't trust you. But they have to open up that full trust, even if it sounds crazy. That's how they both break down each other's walls and then get in this toxic relationship together. But I found a really interesting review on Rotten Tomatoes by a person who's not a legit film critic, and basically the guy was saying that this film is a government conspiracy. They put it out to try to make people like Peter seem crazy when he is speaking absolute truth, and everybody's buying into it. And I found that to be the most interesting thing about this film, is that someone took away from the film that the film was a government conspiracy. So take what you will from that one.
Oh, that is fantastic. I am so glad you found that. That's wonderful. That brings so, I mean, again, I kind of feel sorry for that guy, but at the same time, it so underscores, you know, the point of the sort of the social dimension to mental illness. And yeah, this touches back on several things we've already brought up. But I think, yeah, that, you know, again, his rants are seeded with elements that maybe I won't go so far as to say they're necessarily true, but they're at least plausible. You know, the government has performed experiments on soldiers and so forth and stuff like that. You mentioned MK Ultra, and so again, the film and the script definitely want to draw you into their paranoid fantasies. They want you to share what it's like for them, and so yeah, I think they are seeding it with things that people might sort of recognize, or maybe they've heard these conspiracy theories before, maybe they even believe in them, and that will draw the audience in more to their paranoia. And because, yeah, I mean, it's an old trope in art, right? That if insanity is contagious, then it could be contagious through works of art. You know, you could read a novel that would drive you insane, or hear a song, or watch a movie that would drive you insane. I mean, these are themes which we see in other works, and we've touched on in other things we've talked about here on this podcast. So the idea, and maybe potentially even a real world example here of a film that might actually help, you know, terrifyingly push someone over the edge into insanity and make them indulge in these paranoid delusions. I mean, if that's not effective filmmaking, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, I mean, that is fascinating that this is a government conspiracy. I just wonder who's all in on it. Like, is Tracy Letts in on it? And, you know, Billy Letts, Tracy Letts' mother, wrote that Having a Baby in Walmart movie. I wonder if that was sent out by the Walmart Corporation in order to get more people to go to Walmart. It's a giant corporate conspiracy as well. It's crazy. But I think that's very. I'm glad you found that as well, Shara. That's great. I want to sort of circle back, if I can, to Dr. Sweet's character, because I think that the question that Antonio brought up, whether or not Peter is crazy, there's whether or not, let's try and dial that back. Whether or not Peter is mainly delusional, I think is a central question to interpreting this film. Can we come up with a narrative in which Dr. Sweet is both there and not a doctor, something that accounts for all the evidence? And one of the things that I came up with, and this might be a little conspiracy theory-y as well, but I wonder, like, he enters with Goss. Goss is with him when Dr. Sweet enters. So what is the scene that happened off camera? I mean, is it perhaps possible that Sweet is not a doctor, somebody who was set up by Goss to first talk to RC and then talk to Agnes and Peter directly? Whether or not that this is something that Goss set up in order to flush Agnes out of this relationship, and then of course back into Peter, or back into Goss's arms. That is sort of a narrative that I think has equal plausibility. That this entire scene is a thing that Goss set up so that Agnes would be free of this toxic relationship with Peter, and then that explains why Sweet knows the name of Lloyd, and why Sweet knows that Agnes lost the child, and that would be the thing, according to at least in Goss's mind, that would be the thing that would snap Agnes out of it. That would be the thing that would give Sweet some ethos, some credibility, and then be able to draw Agnes out. Garrett, you have already unmuted your microphone.
Sorry, yeah, I don't mean to monopolize too much, but I just want to say quickly, I agree that that's consistent with everything that's on screen, but I don't think it's as plausible. To me, it seems to me that the more plausible interpretation is that he is, again, maybe not necessarily a doctor in the traditional sense, but he's definitely someone from either the government or some sort of health institution who's tasked with getting Peter back. He's gone to the town. We know he's been asking around because we heard the rumor that someone was asking around about him. And he talked to Goss, and that's where he found out Agnes's son's name. And he filed that piece of information away. He enlists Goss to help get Peter away, which Goss is happy to do. because Goss wants Peter gone as well. I find that more plausible because, I mean, I'm trying to imagine for a moment that you're a friend of Goss or an acquaintance. What on earth would he have to do to you or promise to you that would get you to agree to go into a place where two people are clearly mentally unstable? They've put tinfoil all over the room everywhere. You know, if someone asks me for a favor to help him out and help out with his wife and to go in there, I take one step in that room and go, holy shit, I'm in way over my head. I get the fuck out. So I don't find the idea that he's on Goss's side, rather that Goss is pulling his sweet strings to be as plausible.
Let me go back to something that Jim said, because I actually think it's very interesting and that we should discuss it a little bit. And that's Jim says that that how you interpret the movie is going to hinge very strongly on whether Peter's credible or not. And I'm not sure that's true. Is that true? Because I don't think the point of the movie is whether Peter is credible or not. I think the reason why ambiguity is introduced into the narrative is precisely because it's not a story about whether or not Peter's credible. It's a story about how Peter and what's her face, Ashley Judd's character, are Agnes. That's right. Are playing off each other to this increasingly intensifying, increasingly unhealthy kind of way. I think that's really what the story is about. The thing, it doesn't, there's not really a bottom line to the story. The story doesn't really have a moral per se. It's more an exploration. It wants to show you these two characters interacting, and then that's the sum of the movie. It doesn't want to draw a line under it at the end and say, and then blah, blah, blah. Then they lived happily ever after. And then they were all crazy or whatever. It takes pains, I think, to actually avoid that way of framing.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you there, Antonio. I think, again, speaking big picture here, the thing that I absolutely love most about this movie is that I was never able to get ahead of it. Not for a minute. I understood exactly what was happening as it happened. But, you know, if I paused the film at any point, the first time I saw it, I could not have anticipated what was going to happen in the next scene or in the next a minute from where we were. 98% of the movies I see, you know, like most people, you know how they're going to end, you know, 10, 20 minutes in, you know, and that's not necessarily a criticism. Stories almost follow a very similar pattern. They have similar sort of vocabulary to them. So once you see enough stories, you can anticipate how they're going to play out. But I think this film just completely bucks all my rules, everything that I'm familiar with. I would love to sit down and have a conversation with Tracy Letts, because I don't know how he came up with this story. I don't know what the impetus was, because it's just so unique. I don't know. I can't really compare it to The Exorcist, but that's more in how it's directed rather than how it's written. On the page, I can't compare this to anything else, because it's just so fascinating to me about how creative it is and how much it does not follow traditional rules of storytelling, but is nonetheless completely comprehensible as you go along. It's not like David Lynch, for example, where everything's just fucking weird for being weird's sake. The story makes sense, but it doesn't follow any kind of traditional playbook. And I just love that. After seeing so many movies and getting so used to anticipating where it's going to be, I love being fooled like that.
I was totally fooled in that for the moment that Sweet walks into the hotel, all of us were sitting, there's 4 of us sitting on a couch, and we're all like, where's Goss? Where's Goss? Where's Goss? Where's Goss? Where's Goss? He has to save them. He's the asshole. He hit her. He's abusive as fuck. He's robbed her. But where's our savior, Goss? When is he going to save her? Where the fuck was Goss? And he was, just hanging out outside the hotel when it went up in flames? Was he plotting for her to do this mutual suicide thing? Did he hear Sweet getting stabbed or not? Like, where the fuck was Goss? I was fully expecting Harry Connick Jr. to actually swoop in and be the hero. And he was not there. So, yeah.
I'm glad they didn't go that direction, because that would have made me root for the abusive asshole even more. I think the film does a great job of like making Goss this complicated character. Like, he's a horrible person at the beginning. He's a fucking bully, really. I mean, the way he treats Peter and the way he treats Agnes, he's an asshole. He's a bully. And then by the end of it, he's right. what? The moral ambiguity of flipping that on its head the way it is a masterful writing on the part of Tracy Letts, and that's what I really liked to it. That I sort of picking up what you're laying down there, Shayra, because I thought it was fantastic that he's both right and a complete fucking asshole.
Yeah, I honestly think with Goss, did the government abduct him afterwards? Like, he led them where they needed to go, and then they were like, all right, let's, you know, do a brain wipe of him, or like he's served his purpose. Like, that could go along with what Antonio was saying, where this may actually be a government conspiracy, because if Goss was trying to get back together with Agnes, and we know even though he was abusive to her, he did love her very much. Why didn't he save his wife? In his mind, that was his wife, not his ex. Why didn't he save his wife in that situation? It seems really strange. So I think that almost the fact that Goss didn't save her might back up Antonio's argument about ambiguity there. There
are a couple other ambiguities, I think, that are subtler. I listed the most obvious ones, but a couple that I just realized I forgot to mention one is she lives in a motel room. Presumably the walls aren't super thick, and presumably there's occasionally people on the other side of the wall. And there's a lot of like loud noises, including Peter screaming extensively at the top of his lungs as he rips his fucking tooth out of his head. And like nobody even knocks. Like, it's completely silent. And that's unusual, and sort of pushes in the direction of this being something where there's a perimeter, you know, where there's a periphery involved here. And then another thing is the extensive amount of setup that got put into the room by the end. You know, they bought fly paper in bulk, they bought Raid in bulk, they bought aluminum paper enough to literally cover, you know, how many square feet? It's got to be like, you know, 6,000 square feet of aluminum foil or something like that. All these like ultraviolet lamps and stuff like that. And at no point is anybody like, wow, that's a lot of aluminum foil. What are you using that for? Or maybe I'll call the police because this person who just bought a bunch of aluminum foil also just bought a giant drum of motor oil, you know, of fuel. And again, the fact that all of this just proceeds completely blithely, without any question, without any interruption, without anything, also sort of plays into the potential ambiguity of what's going on here.
I'll just interject real quick here. Kind of funny. I directed a stage version of this, and I bought 2 industrial-sized rolls of aluminum foil, and they didn't question me. So yeah, it was two giant rolls of that we used to cover the stage. I think to sort of go back to I mean, we're still dancing around this question of is Peter delusional? Is there any basis to what he's saying? We're still dancing around that question, and that sort of proves the sort of primacy of that question. As I was approaching directing this, I had to make the first decision I made was whether or not Peter was delusional, whether or not this was a government conspiracy. And what I decided was that 30% of what Peter says is true, and the other 70% is what his imagination is filled in. Now, obviously, this isn't a podcast about a play production in Evansville, Indiana that nobody saw, but it is, you know, we want to stay focused on the film. And so I still think that the film I didn't get that from nowhere. The first exposure that I had to this was from the film, and I thought that the film, on rewatch recently, I found the film stuck to that like 70%, 30% of what he says is real, and then the other 70% is delusion.
Yeah. I think it's super important to emphasize that there's a possibility of a fallacy of the excluded middle here, right? In other words, Peter may be completely nuts, or he may be completely credible, but odds are it's neither. Odds are it's going to be somewhere in between, as you said, you know, toward the more incredible, you know, maybe it's only that he was in the war, and then he went nuts afterward. And on the more extreme end, maybe they did perform experiments on him, but they weren't about bugs or what have you. You know what I mean? So this whole spectrum of possibilities exists for the viewer of the movie, and it's kind of up to the individual viewer to decide how much they're going to weight that.
I also found there that first off, I actually did see Jim's production of the play. I was actually a part of it. I was a stagehand, and I voiced the
very important stagehand. He helped create the gasoline smell, and he was Pizza Harris.
I had a few lines of Pizza Harris.
Garrett was offering Agnes and Peter pizza.
Pizza that was, obviously trying to poison them or do something to them. You're a bad guy in this movie.
Yeah, that's another thing that's never explained, right? Where does the pizza come from, right? They didn't order it, so was that something Goss did? Was that something Dr. Sweet did?
Or did they forget?
Yeah, that's possible too, right? Yeah, so that's another interesting issue that is thrown out there and never really addressed. But Antonio, to your point about no one asking questions about buying the tinfoil and stuff like that, and no one questioning about the sound. I think, as I recall, the film is set in Oklahoma. I think it is. Now I have not spent much time in Oklahoma, but I spent a decent amount of time in West Texas, and it does not surprise me, at least in a similar sort of area, that people would mind their fucking business. That's the kind of place where people do not ask questions. They let people do whatever the hell they want to do.
I wasn't going to interrupt you, Antonio, but I lived in Oklahoma for 2 yeyears, and when you said people were screaming, I was like, that's just another day in Oklahoma, man. It's a great place if you like wind. But yeah, I guess I think you're right though, Antonio, when you say that there's the excluded middle. I made the decision that it's like the 30-70 rule when I had to interpret this work. I don't know. I would sort of like to sit down with William Friedkin and say, okay, to what degree is he correct? To what degree is this the delusions, et cetera, so that there's. But I think as a director, you had to make that decision, and I see where you're getting this ambiguity from. I would still sort of tilt it toward the side of a paranoid schizophrenic or some sort of mental.
Why not both? I'm that person. Why can't it both be true? Like, he could be very much disturbed while also actually being pursued by a government organization. And that would be the thing that could make it credible that he should not be trusted. But how much truth is he speaking? We don't know what he's actually been through. We don't know what kind of experimentation that actually happened to him. He's not trustworthy in his information. So
I think that we can say, I think the film is pretty unambiguous on one thing, at least, that at least part of what goes on between them has to be a delusion, because I think we see it unfold in real time. We see her develop part of the paranoid fantasy with his prodding. That's not something that, that Peter has discovered through his independent research and, was hoping that she would find. She literally creates that out of whole cloth, not whole cloth, but out of those little bits and pieces that he fed her and her own experiences with her son and so forth. And that whole thing about I am the super mother bug, which again, very powerful moment. But that to me is, that part and a few other parts of that speech are obviously paranoid fantasy. And again, so some of it possibly could be true, and exactly how much is certainly open to interpretation. But I think
there's only one problem with that. The sex scene is really disgusting, disturbing. There was a moment where they kiss and there's like this stretch of drool and everyone collectively was like, oh, that's not okay. It was not sensual. I got to see some nice boobs and I was not at all going, oh, those are some nice boobs. I was mainly thinking, this is gross. This is disturbing. I want this to stop. I feel uncomfortable. I feel violated. It was more disturbing than her getting hit by Harry Connick Jr. It was, and we've actually talked about this with certain sex scenes. They can be triggering to people. That was absolutely disgusting to me. I don't know if it's triggering, but it was like, I want this to stop and never happen again. And I feel like the director was implying something insidious happening in that situation. Now, is that a insidious thing of here's how they're going to have a toxic relationship, or is this a literal infection that they are both getting? And I mean, I guess that could be open for interpretation, but it was really gross. Like,
and I think that's a fascinating decision, again, presumably on Friedkin's part, right? Because you could imagine that being done a different way. You could imagine that being a moment of tension relief, right? Where it was just sort of a more of a beautiful thing where you feel their connection, and you sort of have this little warm fuzzy for a little bit before going back into the horror. But he doesn't let you have that moment of a breather. You know, he continues to ratchet up the discomfort and the scheminess of the whole experience. So
Garrett, honestly, about the sex scene is that it's rather most sex scenes are shot to reflect the emotional connection, and this sex scene was shot to completely eliminate the emotional connection and focus in on the biological connection. And I think that's what Cher's talking about, like, you know, with the drool and all that, etc. It focuses on the fact that they biologically connected. That's the importance of that sex scene to the movie, or of showing it. You know, they could obviously have implied it off camera and discussed it later or what have you. But I think the fact that the implication of showing it is to show that they are biologically connected in some way. And again, does that raise the ambiguity? I don't know. It doesn't. I don't think it detracts from it, though.
I agree with that, and I think that, you know, again, you could take sort of a feminist lens on this if you want, because you know, I had somewhat similar reaction about the boobs, right? There's that's nudity, and that's something that should be sort of, you know, titillating to the male gaze and all that stuff, but it completely does not. It's so disturbing and so upsetting that it subverts that traditional sort of male gaze, which sex scenes very often play to.
And there's at the end of the sex scene, there's a really intense close-up of a bug at the end of it. And it's sort of a quick close-up, and then it cuts to black, and then it's back to post-coital during the evening.
It's actually a mantis eating something, if I remember correctly.
Oh, well, what?
it was a bug eating another bug.
Eating something.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It was... For me, because I didn't know anything about this movie going in. I went in completely just not any knowledge of any aspect of it. And I was like, oh my God, they got some bugs in them. That has to be why it's called Bugs. And I was waiting for that horror element to hit, because I was like, there it is. All right, so let's see what alien creature like fell to the earth and got embedded in them, or that never happened. but it felt like that's what it was implying. So I have a hard time with that sex scene, because if it was meant to be pretty obvious that they were crazy, I feel like that scene would have played out differently in the film. Now, obviously, this is a director's choice of how he played out that scene, but it seemed like he was implying that a bug infection happened. I thought she was going to give birth to bugs, honestly. Like, I thought she was going to birth bugs out of herself, or a big bug creature thing. I was waiting for some, you know, David Cronenberg style, like, you know, animatronic crazy thing to come out of her. I don't know, but
you want to know one subtle thing, by the way, about that mantis thing, etc., that I found really I found was really a nice touch in the film. And maybe this is just because I grew up on a ranch and therefore was around bugs all the time, and so like have kind of a awareness of them. I look at a bug and I go, oh, there's a beetle, oh, there's a ladybug, what have you. But one of the things I noticed is, for all the discussion of aphids in the film, none of the bugs shown are aphids.
I just want to throw in there, Shara, I did not go into the film cold. I saw the trailer, and I think the trailer is masterfully done, because the trailer makes you think that's what it's going to be about too. You know, the trailer.
So even the trailer is trying to trick you into thinking it's going to be something else, and then I'm like, wait, is this psychological thriller or is this a horror film? I'm really confused as to where I am, and I think that's why I couldn't predict what was going on. And in a way, that is what makes him so masterful in his directing, because you're sitting there wondering, what the fuck is going on? Why can't I figure this out? This is a mystery. So I appreciated that, honestly, because, like you said, it's refreshing when you can't predict 10 minutes into a film what's going to happen. So, I mean, honestly, at first, my initial reaction was when I saw Peter, I was like, is he a bug? Because he kept doing weird things with his, like, ticks and stuff. And I was like, maybe he's the bug. Maybe he's going to give her bug babies, you know? That was what I took from it at first. So.
And within the delusions that they create, I think you're absolutely right. They do give birth to bug babies. We made them, she says, when we had sex. So within the context of their delusions, that's exactly what happened. But I'm sort of with Garrett on this, and the fact that I think the film is unambiguous in the fact that we never see any bugs except for that one mantis shot. So yeah.
Well, we saw like little creatures like maggots. I think were shown at one point in time during the sex scene. There was when they looked for the egg sac, they cut to these like moving stuff. There was implications that there were actually bugs in the editing of the film. Obviously, that can't play out in a play. So I don't know how that is portrayed in a play. Obviously, you guys would probably be the experts on that. I'm sure you didn't have cuts of bugs pop up on the stage. So
there's cutaway scenes where they will show those little flashes, which are sort of like the transition moments. But I mean, again, there's a clear creative decision. The Friedkin, if he'd wanted to, could have shown us bugs in the scene, in situ, on the bed, through the light, and you don't actually see that. And so I think if Friedkin had wanted there to be more ambiguity, I mean, it wouldn't prove that they're perfectly sane if you just see a bug. It could just be a bug. But he quite deliberately doesn't show, he only shows you in these cut scenes, not in the actual scene itself. And so
it could be like a Hitchcock choice, though, because one of the things that Hitchcock always said is the things that you put into your own mind is actually scarier than what would be put on screen, which is one of the reasons why the American version of Let Me In was really just not as good. There's a lot of CGI crazy stuff that took away from the storyline, whereas we can input our own thoughts into it and really go above and beyond what the filmmaker might put in. So it could be just that he was implanting ideas, which he did in The Exorcist as well. With this demon, he kept flashing a face up on the screen, flash, and it would just be this little moment of something happening, but it was making you come to the conclusion yourself and making you feel like this is a thing that's real. Because even in The Exorcist, is there a demon possession or not? Is this just a case of someone being sick? I mean, they spent a long time in that film going to medical doctors to try to diagnose this girl through science, because this is not a mom that believes in that bullshit, right? So basically, we are then led to believe. And it's a lot of what happens with Mulder and Scully and X-Files, where you have this person that is so believable and making you believe it that you're like, I know this is bull, but I see where Mulder's coming from and I'm almost taking his side on this. So this is hard for me to deal with. And I love it when any kind of film can do that, where they take me out of my own comfort zone and make me start to question my own held beliefs,
Yeah, there's no Scooby-Doo movement in this moment in this, right? Where they rip off the mask and you see it was a con all along, right? We are completely saturated in the mental states of the principal two characters, and because they never get out of the delusion, the film never sort of takes you out of that delusion either. And again, I think that's part of what makes it so effective.
Yes, I think that's exactly the argument I was just about to make. Is it's I think even if you accept that this is a movie that is completely true, in other words, even if you accept that Peter's completely credible and that this recounts a vast government conspiracy, etc., I think it's very important for the movie that you never see any of the bugs, etc., on screen, because the comparison to X-Files and Scooby-Doo is extremely salient. X-Files and Scooby-Doo, by showing the monster at the beginning or what have you, they ultimately expose themselves as a sort of a fantasy, where the core narrative is about the bug. Now we're going to watch Mulder see the bug and then it runs away, and then we're going to see Scully not see it and be all skeptical about it. That becomes what the story is about. Once you show the little CG thing crawling around or whatever. The fact that they don't do this is, again, I think highlights that it's not about, the movie is not about whether or not there's bugs under this dude's skin. what the movie is ultimately at core about is about the sense of desperation it's about desperation in context of acceptance. It's about the how some forms of acceptance can make people who in desperation just completely flip their lives over. And I don't think you can argue that this doesn't happen for both characters. You know, Aggie obviously, you know, goes from small town waitress to, you know, torching herself. But at the same time, Peter, he doesn't have a bunch of marks when we initially meet him. He isn't like, you know, ranting about the government and stuff when we meet him. He's relatively laid back and composed. And his desperation and the desperation activated by Aggie's small measure of acceptance just causes him to just regurgitate all the stuff that he's been holding in and turn into almost a completely different person by the end of the movie. And that's really what the movie's about. And if you show the bug at any point, if at any point you say this is what the story ultimately boils down to, it becomes entirely about Peter's quest to convince people of the truth. And it completely decontextualizes all that emotional interplay that the movie's really about.
I think you're absolutely right, Antonio. This is a film about relationships and how toxic relationships can be. One line that sort of keyed me into it and probably became sort of the thematic line of the entire film was Peter once asked Agnes, "How long have you been married?" And she says, "Long enough to still get scared at night." And I think that's, first of all, that's a hell of a description of a marriage and hell of a description of a relationship. And I love how, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And if we analyze all of these relationships, there's all some degree of toxicity, except perhaps in the relationship between Agnes and RC. Aside from that, every relationship in this film is to some degree toxic. And I think that's the central theme of this film. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the reality or unreality of the bugs, but I think the real question is the reality or unreality of a functional relationship that leads to mutual acceptance to both characters, or, you know, the betterment of each other's lives. And that's simply not the case in this film. And this film is about how toxic relationships can be and how relationships as a thing themselves have a degree of trap. There's relationships to some degree are traps as portrayed in this film. And I think that's where a lot of the writing and a lot of the creative energy is going in this film.
I want to focus more on the relationships, but quickly before doing that, I want to veer back for a moment to the X-Files before we get too far away from that, because there was indeed a notorious episode of the X-Files that involved bugs, and there was one moment in particular that I thought was quite clever, where, you know, the director or whomever had a fake bug go across the screen of the viewer. And, you know, if you're watching it alone at night and you see what looks like the shadow of a bug going across your screen, it's a big jump moment. It was one of those little clever manipulations. And I kind of expected that to happen in this movie. And I was really glad that it didn't. But again, for precisely the same reason I've been talking about, because I expected it, because I anticipated it. And, you know, they didn't give me that. I felt that they kept me, you know, kept me guessing and kept me wrong at almost every turn. So that's an interesting contrast between the directorial decisions made in the X-Files versus Friedkin's decisions here.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that that particular X-Files episode is exactly about contagious delusions and is called Folie à Deux. So talking about relationships, now it's time for everybody's favorite moment where I put my feminist hat on and give you guys all a feminist analysis of the movie, okay? So if the movie's about relationships and toxicity, let me posit an interpretation to you of the Aggie character, okay? So we know that the Aggie character comes from an abusive relationship, right? And so the movie explicitly frames her as lonely and as coming from an abusive relationship, and it also specifically frames her as not having figured out particularly healthy ways to deal with the abusive relationship. You know, when Goss comes back through the door, she immediately becomes much more passive, much more willing to be pushed around by him, especially after he hits her, understandably enough. And notably, she lets him keep coming through the door and doesn't say, like, you know, I've got the cops. She doesn't pull a gun on him and say, you know, stand your ground, log, get the hell out of my place. You know, there's all kinds of much more extreme reactions she could be taking to this, you know, fairly evil and, you know, impositional character with no real redeeming qualities. Like he doesn't treat her in any scene in a way that you would walk away from that and think, oh, well, no wonder she fell in love with him. You know what I mean? There's no point at which Goss is remotely sympathetic interpersonally. And so, and yet she keeps letting him walk through the door. And so the implication here, I think, is fairly strong that she has not completely gotten past her abusive relationship, right? And this sets her up to take the fall in the second relationship. This sets her up to become enmeshed in Peter's delusions and paranoia to the point where it becomes incredibly self-destructive. And so the metaphor that I pick up here, and again, you know, I'll throw this out to you guys. You guys go ahead and pick it apart. But the feminist metaphor here that I'm picking up is that as a woman, you need to be able to assert your individuality in a relationship over and against your partner. You need to be able to stand up to your partner and say, no, you're not going to do that to me ever again, and you're going to prison. Or that's just crazy. There's no way that's true, you know? And the fact that Aggie is a damaged personality that has been operant conditioned perhaps to not operate in that mode, I think contributes to the end of the movie very directly and significantly. You know, in fact, we can say it's sine qua non. If Aggie had a slightly healthier perspective, if she brought a slightly healthier perspective on relationships into the relationship with Peter from the one she had with Goss, we can plausibly argue the entire movie would have gone very, very differently and would have ended on a completely different note. So what do you guys think of that, of this particular feminist interpretation? So the TLDR is the message, the moral of the movie is don't stand for abusive relationships. And before you even get into a relationship, make sure you're a strong enough person that you're willing to stand up to anybody who says crazy shit or does crazy shit to you.
Yeah, but that could be said about guys too. I mean, I think a lot of the times in any relationship, no matter what the combo is, but this does primarily happen with men and women and men doing it to women, is there's usually someone who wears the pants. They would say, who wears the pants? And generally with people who aren't as educated or have a lot of baggage or a lot of brokenness, they will usually go to the person that they think is a little bit more put together. And as you guys said, when Peter was introduced into the story, he seemed like a much more put together person, especially since, you know, she was getting beat by an ex and this guy came in and he was like, I got you muffins. Like he seemed a lot more, you know, functional compared to her. So she might have just gone to him because he seemed better than her.
Going with the feminist interpretation here, the first cue we have that there's going to be something toxic and wrong about Peter is after he's obviously walked in on Goss just having beat the shit out of her, he doesn't do anything. He doesn't say, dude, should I drop an anonymous tip off at the cops, or do you want me to go slash his tires? You know, like he doesn't express any concern other than for her immediate health. He doesn't say, you need to not ever let that asshole back through the door. He doesn't have outrage on her behalf. And I think this is the first cue that we get that there's something in his personality where certain types of toxicity are just going to be passed over.
So, he does, though. He says, I don't like that he hit you. I think his first concern is for her well-being and her, like he gets her aspirin, he gets her ice, he tries to help her. And I think there's Goss is such he sucks up all the energy in the room. And I think it's, I guess I'm sort of quibbling with the sort of Monday morning quarterbacking of what Peter should have done in those cases. I'm not clearly. I understand that those were the things that you suggested were viable things to be done, but I think that he's focused on her during those moments, not so much this let's go get the cops and focused on the offender. He's focused on the victim rather than the offender, I guess is what I'm saying.
Sure, but think about how most movies play out scenes of domestic violence when somebody who's like a romantic interest comes in or whatever. You don't just see like a disapproval expressed and then we move on to other matters. There's a moral outrage that comes with that almost invariably. And
I think that's why it made it seem so real, because I've actually been that person, and I hate to say it, but I've been that person, but it has a lot to do with how the victim is going to respond. Because if you call the cops and the victim is going to be like, oh no, it was fine, I bumped into a wall, then you're incredible anyway, and you need them to be on that page to stand up for themselves. Because if they're not standing up for themselves, then you are just calling the cops for no reason, and they, brush it aside. Because that's actually something that was presented to me when I was in an actual courtroom talking about this discussion. They're like, why didn't you call the cops when you saw these things occurring? It's impossible to get that out there if the victim is not willing and open to talking about it, because they are going to defend the person who's attacking them. They just will. And I don't know if that's something he knew, but he also did a lot of other things. I don't know if they actively did this, but you'll notice when Goss is interacting with Peter, he's making sure not to give him eye contact to try to show that he's not an antagonistic person. These are all things that you're actually instructed to do when you're around somebody like that, to keep your cool and to calm down about it, because otherwise it'll just escalate the situation. And he actually de-escalated what was going on by his behavior. That's why Goss was like, whatever, just take care of her. And he did. He got her a muffin and some aspirin.
It psychologizes too much, though, because the purpose of those scenes is not to depict, a realistic relational interaction. It's to tell us, the viewers, things about the characters that we're seeing on screen, right? It has a narrative purpose. And that's why, even though in real life, the way domestic violence often goes is very quietly and gets pushed under the rug a lot, in movies, almost 100% of the time, people flip out when domestic violence occurs. And even if they don't flip out, they'll at least say, something to the effect of, do you want me to call the cops? What do you want me to do about him? What are you going to do if he comes back? Et cetera, et cetera. And you don't really see this expressed too much in this particular context. And again, this is a very carefully put together movie. You have to assume that all of these decisions are intentional on the director's part.
Yeah, well, I think they're intentional on the screenwriter's part or the playwriter's part. But I think, to my mind, how I interpreted that was that it's not that Peter doesn't care. It's that he's just so socially awkward. He doesn't know what to do. This is not the kind of thing that he has the grace to handle. He cares about her. He wants to help her. But calling the cops is definitely not something he's going to do under any circumstances. This guy's afraid of the cops as part of his paranoia. So, that's how I interpreted that. But since we're talking about the feminist lens, I think it's a very good one to bring up, Antonio. I want to come back to the character of RC here, because one of the most shocking scenes for me and most powerful scenes is after, Peter sort of has his seizure almost, and he sort of starts hitting himself, and RC and Agnes hold him down, and then Agnes slaps RC. And that totally fucking nailed me. It's like, oh my God, this is the one person who's clearly healthy in your life, who clearly is there and can help you get away from this toxic guy, and she just slaps her, and and just cuts that tie entirely. And RC understandably never comes back after that. And so this comes back again to the way I would put the feminist point. Again, it's one of the standard or old school feminist talking points. Like, don't need no man, right? Be a strong, independent woman. Ashley Judd's character Agnes clearly does need not even necessarily a man, but someone. She's just so lonely.
But she had RC, and she had a really close. They were kissing each other on the lips. They were doing some sort of sexual dance even. It was, in my mind, I thought they actually had some romantic involvement, at least at some point in time in their history. So I found it interesting she didn't see RC as that outlet. But what's interesting, though, is I've been RC. That has literally happened to me in my life. And I had my closest friend in my entire life do that exact thing to me. So it's so real to me. It was like ridiculous when I was watching that. I was like, my life is being turned into a movie, and I think it's very weird and creepy. But it's one of those things where, like, you have to be that friend that stands up for your friend, and if it means you lose them, you have to still do the right thing, and that's what RC does. Like, right. That's 100% what she does.
She tries, at least, right?
Yeah.
And that, I think, actually, again, it's part of what makes the feminist analysis of this film a difficult one, because I think that it really, I wouldn't say it puts the lie to the idea that you don't need no man, but it shows how shallow that can be when you are completely alone. I mean, again, she has the one friend with RC, but RC clearly cannot do it for her, not just in the sexual sense necessarily. I agree, there's some erotic tension there, maybe a history, but RC cannot meet her emotional needs. Goss definitely cannot meet her emotional needs. And so that's why when Peter enters her life, she is so desperate to keep him there, because it's all she has. And so this sort of blithe, don't need no man isn't taking, I think, the realities of human relationships seriously enough, because we do need other people. We need other people to keep us sane and to keep us grounded. And unfortunately, it does the exact opposite in this case. You know, her desperate need to be recognized and to have someone appreciate her and listen to her and have someone she can talk to is what drags her over the edge. So it complicates the feminist story, I think, because it does show and put an emphasis on how much human interaction and human validation is a legitimate human need.
I don't know if that's true, though. I mean, what's the problem with framing the movie in a feminist term as Aggie's tragic flaw is at the end of the day she needs a man?
I think the problem with that is that it's a tragic flaw that she is, I think, not strong enough to stand up for herself in that way. I would prefer that way of framing it. But I think part of what makes her so sympathetic is, again, it's not hard to imagine yourself in her shoes. If I was alone and in a hotel in the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma and desperate for any kind of human interaction, yeah, I could see myself, I mean, not in a completely vivid way, but at least partially, the impulse to go crazy like that, to hold on to the one person that you have in your life. When you have, only one friend and an abusive ex-husband, the one thing that's good in your life, how can you take this away from me? Like she says to RC, why do you want to take this away from me? That's heartbreaking, because how can you, right? It shows how powerfully she needs the other human being. And that, to me, is a realistic portrayal of human psychology. So it's not her tragic flaw. I mean, if it is her tragic flaw, it's humanity's tragic flaw. It's human, all too human.
We need to talk to each other and be close with one another. And that's why part of the story is showing that her son went missing and she had been looking for him. Now she has all the baggage she needs to really try to hold on to people, because she's so afraid of losing everyone. And she is willing to go down quite a rabbit hole just to maintain a relationship with somebody. And the thing is, I know that this happens quite often with a lot of women. They will get into these really tragic relationships with some very toxic people, and they will completely cut off their family, their friends, and they do have some evidence that is put forth by their new partner that comes into play, that he kind of tries to isolate her a little. But there is definitely something that happens where these people become more and more isolated, and therefore are more capable of being manipulated and delusional. And honestly, I think that they both were hurting each other in the end. I don't think either one of them was helpful to one another, but I think it did have an initial start of the isolating her from people being what started everything to go really wrong.
Well, two points about RC. First, she has a romantic partner at the beginning of the film. She's on the phone with Ronnie, and she is called away because something happened with Ronnie. And then there's that second in the second RC scene, there's a moment when RC, or Agnes reports that RC and Ronnie have gained custody of Ronnie's child, and the quote is RC, or no, Ronnie is the name of, I'm sorry, I might be screwing up the names here. But anyway, RC is going
to... Voice, I think, is the name of...
Yeah, The Voice. Thank you. Yeah, Ronnie is RC's actual name. So yeah, anyway, but RC has a romantic partner, and then there's we're given to understand that there's some degree of permanence to that relationship, because they're adopting a child together. What's also true is that in the first scene with RC, she suggests all of the things that you suggested, Antonio: buying a gun, calling the cops. Agnes dismisses all of these things out of hand, saying they just won't work. He'll still keep calling. That, now, you can talk about whether or not that's bullshit or not. It probably is. It's probably sort of a defeatist attitude that Agnes has toward authority and
or even loneliness.
And loneliness, yeah. I mean, but I think that the central point about RC is that she is this positive presence, and I think the moment that I felt that Agnes had really gone over, so to speak, was when it's exactly the scene you're talking about, Garrett, when she slaps RC and says, "Why would you take the one thing that means something to me?" That's the moment when I knew that that Agnes had sort of flipped into Peterland, and it's all as a result of these. You know, and I don't think it's necessarily just women. I think everybody can go in too deep into relationships. I guess we're quoting fucking Phil Collins songs now, but we're going in too deep into relationships to the point where we take these relationships as our entire world, and that is an unhealthy behavior. And that's also a human need. It's a human need to sort of be recognized and assuage our loneliness. And to that degree, I think this film has sort of a universal appeal to it.
Yeah, if the film has a social moral, I think the social moral is definitely that healthy human identity is not found in polarity. It's not found in mirroring. It's found in a 360-degree view. It's found in having people who have angles on you from multiple directions.
And that brings us back to like cults, right? And one of the big things that cults do is they cut you off from anyone outside the cult, so you can't get that 360 degrees. You only have that narrow path. And there's a reason why that works. There's a reason why cult leaders do this. There's a reason why, you know, people like Alex Jones or other sort of radicals want you to only talk to people who have already drank the Kool-Aid and accept this particular interpretation of reality. Because if all you hear is that same sort of echo back, then that is the reality that you will accept. And so maybe this is a good point to transition from a feminist analysis to a postmodern analysis of the film. We've been talking a lot about whether or not you know, there's a true answer to this question, whether or not they're crazy, whether or not they're delusional, whether or not what they're saying has some truth to it. Maybe the one way of approaching that question is to say that's the wrong question to ask. That speaks as if there is some sort of top-down transcendental reality that is the case. Either they're crazy, they're not, or they're somewhere in between. And you know, maybe we could take that sort of the postmodern lens to sort of say that, you know, the film presents a reality that is sort of complete unto itself, and we don't need to sort of go beyond it. We don't need to ask ourselves what's the truth behind this story. The story just is what it is.
Yeah, I think you're right, Garrett, and I also think that it's important to note that of the male characters in this film, the only one who is active in limiting Agnes's social interactions is Goss. It's not Peter. Peter is, if you want me to go, I'll go. If you want to bring other people in, that won't work. Although there are a couple scenes when Agnes tries to call the cops, but any sort of authority figure Peter is saying no to, but he's not limiting her access to RC, for example. It's Agnes who makes that choice to push RC away. But yeah, I think that's an interesting analysis that I mean, this is kind of a postmodern film because we are subduing ourselves in the reality of only these characters for much of the movie.
I'm going to have to disagree with you. I think that he did make it so that she had to choose between him and RC. I think he specifically set it up that way, and he knew which way it would go. I think he was purposefully, and I'm only saying this because, once again, I've lived it. But maybe I don't know, maybe the writer didn't live it or know these kinds of things. But I've literally lived this, where there's a form of manipulation where you set it up for the person to feel like they're the ones choosing that. And that's literally what Peter's character does throughout the film on other aspects too. So why not with RC? I think he was purposely manipulating the situation at all times to make Agnes feel like she was the one coming to these conclusions, not that he was forcing it down her throat, because a lot of people need to feel like they come to their own conclusions on things, because we come from a, you know, time period where we'd like to think that we're pretty smart and we could figure things out on our own. And not have somebody just dictate to us what we are supposed to agree with. So I think he purposely put his message across in a way that made her feel like she chose these things, where she really wasn't, because it's pretty obvious she was not in the mental state or the, you know, intellectual ability to come to these conclusions on her own. Like, he fed a lot of this garbage to her, including the fact that RC was all behind this. I mean, that's what eventually happens, right? She thinks that RC was all behind this. This is how they got the custody of the child, was some kind of a plan and a plot with the government. So I honestly think he fed into that view, that Agnes, I think he led her down a path. I really do.
I think that, go ahead, Garrett, sorry.
I was going to say, I think that kind of cuts both ways, though. I don't think he has the mental capacity to deliberately manipulate her like that. If he were a literal cult leader, that's almost certainly what he would have been doing. But I like when he has the seizure, for example. I mean, indeed, it's compatible with what's on the screen. I don't think the film is unambiguous on this point. That could be an act that he's putting on to control her, but that's not how I interpret it. To me, it seems to me that he is sincerely, you know, believes himself to be being attacked in that moment, and is reacting in earnest at that experience. So I don't think, you know, the way I see the character of Peter, he doesn't have the presence of mind to be manipulative. I mean, there's a sense in which, in the same sense in which all human relationships are manipulative, of course, sure, he's manipulating her, but it isn't some sort of Machiavellian scheme where he has this grand architecture plot to try to bring her in with him.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody actually does do that, though. Like, I think a lot of the times, and this is where this movie really solidly puts this forth, our delusions and our manipulations and our lies we feed ourselves, a lot of the time we are completely ignorant of what we are deluding ourselves with or what we're lying to ourselves about. So it's entirely possible that he was being manipulative and being a liar, but to himself as well. And we are fully capable of doing that, to the point of, yeah. I mean, it's legit. Like, you see it happening a lot now. I mean, maybe I'm in different circles because of certain family relations, but I've definitely seen a psychological adjustment on people that I used to think could think for themselves as of late, and it's kind of scary. They have no idea, no clue that they are deluding themselves. So it's entirely possible that he wasn't like plotting to be manipulative or plotting to do these things, but was very much lying to himself because he very much needed that relationship as well. And I'm going to do my dude bro moment. I have to bring up a Rick and Morty episode. If anybody has ever watched that show, one of my favorite moments is when they are analyzing the parents and find out that they are both very unhealthy for one another. And at one point, the guy who's analyzing them says, "They're codependent," and runs away in absolute fear. And I feel like that is the best way to react to this film, is that they both were not very good for each other, but they do work well together. They achieved their goals and their delusions together, very much so.
Honestly, I apologize in advance to Noah for further crapping on his channel views here, but honestly, if you wanted to make a macrocosmic analogy between the relationship you see in this movie, it's not unlike the relationship that Trump and his voters have, in that they're both lying to each other really hard and really sincerely, and it's super unhealthy, and everyone outside it can see how unhealthy it is, and they're both just in fucking love with each other.
Now, not to get too political on that point, though, but I do. I mean, for Chair, I think that restated that way, I'm more on board with your point that that there's manipulation going on. Yeah, I think that's makes more sense now that you've restated it. But to the political point, and I think one minor thing that you said there was that you described people who you thought could think for themselves. And I think part of what this film does, and does really well, is sort of show how easy it would be for almost anyone if you removed social support, if you removed friends, if you lost friends, if you were alienated from the people who you thought cared about you because, you were considering voting for Trump or stuff like that, yeah, you might flee into the arms of a group that does accept you, that does sort of validate you and helps you, even if that's unhealthy, even if it's delusional. That could happen to anybody. It's uncomfortable to imagine the idea that we would flee to a cult or to a delusional relationship or to an abusive or a toxic relationship. But it's the same psychological mechanisms. It has nothing to do with the level of intelligence or ability to think for yourself or critical thinking. It's that deep emotional human need to be recognized and to be validated. And if one half the people are telling you that you're stupid, you're crazy, you're a Nazi or whatever, and these other people over here are saying, no, you're normal, you're one of us, you can be accepted, then yes, you're going to go to those people, no matter how toxic the stuff that they are spewing in other contexts.
And the important thing about that, I guess the moral of that is that you need to have that painful experience of dissent in order to be a stable human personality, right? That consensus reality is reality for humanity, but the problem with that is that if you're in a bubble, the consensus becomes warped. And so how do you break out from that? And I think the inescapable conclusion of the movie is, again, you have to have that 360-degree view. You have to have people who, when you're full of shit, are going to come to you and say, you're full of shit. And then you have to actually keep yourself in the mental frame to accept that that's going to be a painful consequence of living in a world where you don't end up going nuts and torching yourself.
I think there's one important distinction here, and I think it is also something that we can differ on and still have logical interpretations of the film. I posited at the beginning of this podcast that one of the questions that we'd have to answer is whether or not Peter is being deliberately manipulative, and not manipulative in the sense that he knows that something is wrong, that something is bullshit, and then he's convincing Agnes of the truth of that bullshit. And I think that's one difference between Trump and Peter, whereas I think Trump knows to some degree, at least once or twice when he lies, that he's lying, and that it's a cynical selling of bullshit, and that they're going to lap it up no matter what. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's an interpretive question that I think we all have to ask ourselves as we come away from this film does Peter believe everything that he's saying, or is there a moment when he's bullshitting them and trying to convince them of a lie that he knows is a lie, right? Am I making myself clear here?
Yeah, I recently watched the movie Gaslight, and I think that that's a very pertinent film to bring up with this. It was very clear in that film that the protagonist was purposefully being manipulative to make her feel crazy, whereas I don't think that that is the case with Peter at all. But I definitely think he was being manipulative, but only because he wanted to have a bond with someone, not necessarily because he is full of shit. But I've noticed with my own interactions with narcissists and people that have that kind of behavioral problem, the question that always comes up when I'm having conversations with others when I'm trying to deal with that person is, are they aware that they're lying, bullshitting assholes, or like, are they not? Because that then brings up the whole free will determinism, maybe. Like, that's where that whole debate starts up, right? Like, are they actively being shitty, or are they just a little broken inside and we can't really blame them for it. And that's where you have to decide how you react. And that's where the problem comes, right? You're trying to figure out how I'm supposed to react to this character or this person that I'm interacting with. Am I supposed to be mad at them, or do I need to feel sorry for them and help them? And in a lot of the older films, it was really obvious. This person is a bad guy. He's walking like this and he's going after the girl. But with Peter, you're like, I don't know. And that's what real life is like, right? And I kind of like that films have gone to that place, but it also is really hard to interpret them at that point, right? Because now it's open.
I think the reason that it becomes...
let me real quick. I think that's what postmodernism has done, right? It's removed this objective truth, and I think that's where we come from. That's where we go to the point where we're like, okay, Trump's an asshole because he knows he's lying, but Peter's a tragic character because he's unaware of the ridiculousness of his own point of view. I'm sorry, Antonio, I interrupted you, but go ahead.
Yeah, all I was going to say is I think in terms of deception that that we need to be careful also not to indulge in a fallacy of the excluded middle as well, because I think deception exists on a spectrum. It's not binary as these questions have been. You know, it's not does he know he's lying or is he just being completely sincere. In a lot of cases, that question doesn't even arise on the mind of the interlocutor because it doesn't matter. He wants it to believe it very desperately. It's very important for him personally to believe it. And so the question of, am I lying to this person or not, isn't even on his mind.
Okay, yeah, and I think it's good to come back now to the character of Dr. Sweet, because I think you can compare and contrast. Dr. Sweet is clearly, deliberately manipulating Agnes. There's no ambiguity in that. He's trying to get what he wants, and he doesn't particularly care whether or not he hurts her in that process. He's obviously throwing some dangerous emotional landmines out there. Now again, you can make a sort of ends justify the means argument there, perhaps, if you want, but there's nothing, I think, ambiguous about that. I did want to mention quickly, because I wanted to come back to one of the points that you made, Jim, about Dr. Sweet's character. Yeah, I can't square the point about him smoking the crystal or whatever it was. That is a strange one. But the other point you made about him playing into her delusion, I'm not a therapist, but my wife is, and I've talked to her about this. She's worked in prisons before, and I sort of asked her, like, what do you do with delusional inmates, patients? Do you ever sort of play into their delusions? And she actually, she says yes. That if you have a patient who is almost certainly not going to be able to be cured in any sort of traditional sense of that phrase, and playing into his delusion is the only way you can get him to behave, then you play into his delusion, because the alternative is he does something that gets himself hurt. And so if your only choices are play into the delusion to keep him safe, or try to sort of stick with the real reality and endanger his well-being, the ethical thing to do from her point of view, at least, was to very clearly just do play into the delusion. And I think I'm inclined to agree with that if you accept that basic dilemma. And that again brings us right back sort of to the postmodernism, right? Is maybe it doesn't make sense to ask what's the truth here. Maybe instead it only makes sense to say how the world appears from the various points of view that we're presented with.
Actually, that is so interesting you say that, because it kind of reminds me of, I can't pronounce the name of it, but it's a Kurosawa film, Rashomon. I can't pronounce it, but it plays into that, like, what is truth so well, where you have all these different perspectives of the same exact thing happening, and there is no truth at the end. We don't know what is the actual truth, because we've heard all these different perspectives and they're all a little skewed, and that's actually how reality is. And being able to make a film like that, that makes you question what is truth, and it doesn't matter, because what the truth is more about, like, what is humanity, what are our morals, what are the things that we're actually trying to create as a world. And that does have to do with postmodernism at this point, right? Like, that's a huge part of that. So I really like that you brought that up. So
yeah, and there's now that I think about it, actually, there's another more recent film called Stonehurst Asylum with Ben Kingsley, and there's a scene in that where Ben Kingsley plays a doctor who is deliberately playing into the delusions of one of his patients, a patient who believes himself to be a horse, and he's feeding him an apple. And one of the other doctors says, "Wait, you're playing into his delusions? Why that will inhibit the cure. You won't be able to cure him if you do that. And Ben Kingsley's response is, you want to make a perfectly miserable man out of a perfectly happy horse. That was just a great little line, and wonderfully delivered by Sir Ben Kingsley. And it's in some ways the opposite of this, right? And I think probably the more traditional role in Bug, curing them. It might not necessarily make them happy, but it certainly would make them not suicidal. Yeah, Shutter Island. Someone mentions that, and that Shutter Island is another good example of trying to cure the delusions in these ways.
I think, yeah. I mean, I guess we're going against my my 2 weeks of paramedic training on mental health issues, where they said never do that. So Sirius is far more experienced than I am. So I guess I'm sort of approaching it from a different angle. I think the difference between Bug and some of these other films that we're mentioning is that I haven't seen the Ben Kingsley film that you're talking about. That's a great line from a film I haven't seen. But Shutter Island, the explicit goal of playing into the delusion is to get him out of that delusion. The explicit goal of that therapeutic adventure is to get him to see an objective reality. One of the things I love Rashomon, of course. It's a classic. It's a great film. I came away from that film thinking that the last story told was the one that was closest to what happened, because it was the one that was able to take all the previous stories I saw, some of which were diametrically opposed, and be able to make all of them true. Bug, on the other hand, I think we're right to view it in a postmodern lens, because there's no, aside from those cutscenes at the very beginning and the post-credit scene, I think we're given to understand that this is, I'm siding on the idea that this is a delusion that becomes self-destructive. But anyway,
that's not how I remember it. Sorry, little Rashomon reference there.
Right, and there's also a film called Vantage Point, which is even worse. It's sort of poor man's Rashomon, and it's not. It tries to do the same things and doesn't work. But
so I'm looking at the clock here, and I think I want to sort of try to stick for our general sort of 2-hour time frame. I mean, I don't necessarily want to force it to end if we still have more to talk about, but I do want to start sort of angling a little bit towards wrapping it up. And so I have a question for all of you guys. We've been doing a lot of analysis, and again, sort of, I think, praising this film rather highly. Are there any criticisms you have? Anything you think the film does wrong, or that you wish had done different, or you think could have been done better?
One of the things I saw come up a lot from people and their criticisms of it was that it was trash. It's an ugly film. It is ugly, but I think it's purposefully ugly. You took a movie like Monster, where you have Charlize Theron, where she purposely goes out of her way to make herself become this really ugly monster. And I think that similarly, this was done with Bug. You have someone who is generally known as being a very attractive actress that a lot of people think is beautiful. And she was greasy haired. She didn't have on makeup. She was smoking and drinking and doing drugs and was wearing really ugly clothing in an ugly place. Everything was ugly, gritty, gross, grimy, slimy, gross. So I think a lot of the times when people are criticizing it by calling it trash, it's like, I think you're missing the point. Like, I think you missed a point.
The style deliberately, I think, evokes cinema verite, and I think that's part of the point of the visual style. I found the visual style very coherent, and I didn't think the movie was beautiful, but that's not the point of the movie. As far as critiques, I thought the soundtrack was completely forgettable. No, but more seriously, as far as critiques, my biggest critique for the movie would probably be that the ambiguity in the movie is kind of clunkily rolled out. There are ways to do that kind of ambiguity, like particularly resorting to like end credits still shots. That's just cheesy. Like, let's keep it real. Like, it's not super rigorous direction there. It's a little lazy. And I thought a number of the other like sort of ambiguities and details were likewise kind of lazy. Another thing that I didn't particularly like about it was the use of cuts to like, you know, shots of bugs and stuff like that. Those are obviously jarring and they're intended to evoke a particular, you know, emotional color or what have you. But without some context and without some information as to what we as the viewer are supposed to be experiencing or taking away from this, it really just kind of jars you out of the movie and resembles some of those like cheesy procedural TV shows where like in between, like, you know, scene ends as they're walking off toward the crime scene, and then you see like, you know, cut to like 15 shots of flashing police lights in 3 seconds, and then now they're at the crime scene or whatever. It was evocative of that in a negative way. So I'd say that there's some quibbles about how the movie's shot. The movie's soundtrack is forgettable. As far as the way the movie and the movie's ambiguities could have been more cohesively developed, I guess. Where I don't think the movie has any weaknesses is I think the performances were Oscar worthy. They were amazing performances by everybody. Everybody came off completely as a believable personality. There was no point at which I was like, oh yeah, she's just reading those lines. The acting in particular was super, super spot on. And as I said before, and this is actually something that I came around on. When I first saw the movie, I kind of was disappointed with the resolution. I wished that they had made a little bit less ambiguity and made things a little bit more clear. But over the course of thinking about it, I've come to realize that the having the ambiguity in the movie and precisely never letting the viewer draw a conclusion is, as I pointed out to you before, the thing that decisively intercuts this between a monster fantasy and an actual movie about relationships. So that's where they really do it well.
I'll go and then I'll also sort of wrap up and give my own give my star rating of the film as well. So since we're sort of ending here, so in order to answer this question, I have to give my history and experience with this film. I saw it in 2007 the first time, and I loved it. I can't actually remember what criticisms I had of it. I don't know if I had any at the time. I you know, it's 11 years ago, so it's hard to remember what criticisms I had of it. And I didn't watch the film, and then I knew that I was directing a staged version of it, so I deliberately didn't watch it prior to the stage production, just because I wanted to have my own interpretation. And so when I watched it again last week, it wasn't so much criticisms as like, oh, he made that choice. That's different from the choice I made. The choice I made was clearly better. So those were the sort of bullshit, egoistic thoughts that I had in my head. And I tried to, it was one of those things where I was like trying to argue with myself and saying, no, that's, you know, this is Billy Friedkin we're talking about here. Let's not shit on his work in favor of your own. So it's really hard for me to have any sort of objective point of view of the movie, because I lived it for 6 months as I was working on the project. And so that sort of colors my criticisms of it now. I give this film 4.5 stars. That's probably the highest I've been on a film in this podcast, because I love the story. I love the themes. I think if I were trying to quibble with it, I would say that maybe it's a little bit too talky for a film, but even then I love characters talking, so that's not even much of a quibble. I love this movie, and I love this story, and I love what it's saying about relationships and how we need that. It's the old Woody Allen joke at the end of Annie Hall. You know, a guy goes into a doctor's office and he says, "Doc, you know, I think my brother's crazy." And the doctor says, "Well, why don't you have him committed?" And he said, "Well, I would, but I need the eggs." And that's, you know, the joke about relationships, that they're crazy and irrational and stupid, but we all keep going back to them because we need the eggs. And I think that that's a lot of what this film is saying about relationships, and that really resonates with me. So it really I like it. I like the story, and that's why I stand. So I'll throw it back to you, Garrett, or Shayra, or Antonio.
You left out the crucial setup to the joke that my brother's crazy. He thinks he's a chicken.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, fuck. How did I fuck up that joke? It's my favorite joke of all time, and I fucked it up. What the hell?
Sorry to make it put you on the spot like that, Jim.
Can we cut that part out?
No, I love this. I actually think that we should get a screenshot of Jim feeling bad about how he put on the jokes. It's like,
So, Antonio, I think it's great that you mentioned the soundtrack's forgettable, because I actually have to agree with you there. I can't really remember a single song on the soundtrack, but I definitely remember every soundtrack. All right. I remember every single song on Jim's version of the soundtrack. So his production, the soundtrack was indeed superior. I think, at least if memorability is any measure in that regard.
Did he play "I Got You Under My"?
Alas, no. That would have been probably a little too on the nose, I think.
I'll give him a brief internet fame. It was by an original Oklahoma. I had an all original soundtrack by an Oklahoma band, actually Texas and Oklahoma band, called Fish Fry Bingo. If you can look up some of their stuff, they're awesome. I lost track of them, but so anyway, we're once again referencing a thing that only you and I have seen, Garrett. So.
But anyway, to come back quickly to the acting, I can't say I'm generally a fan of Ashley Judd as an actor. I can't think of anything else I've seen her in that I would say even thought she did a good performance in, but then that she was phenomenal in this. I think this is, at least of the films of hers I've seen, easily her best work. And so, yeah, I tremendous credit to her and to the whole cast, I think, for being wonderfully acted, wonderfully shot, wonderfully directed, and again, the screenplay is just phenomenal. I'm with you, Jim. I love this movie. I think it's flawless. There isn't anything I can think I would change about it. It's just a film that I can watch again and again and again and keep coming back to. I find it endlessly fascinating and insightful and legitimately scary in a social way that cuts deep to the heart of the need for human beings to be seen and validated and understood and believed, more so than we need to breathe, more so than we need to stay alive. We need that. And that's a genuinely terrifying thing. I mean, Jim, you said relationships are traps, right? And they're toxic, they're poisonous. But yeah, we it's the only thing we have to eat. You know, the eggs may be toxic, but if we don't have them, you know, we starve to death. We need that more than anything else. And it's only there, but for the grace of God, that all of us don't fall into a relationship so toxic and so demoralizing that it destroys our sense of reality and our sense of self. And that's a genuinely terrifying thought, much more terrifying than any vampire or zombie or anything like that, in my opinion. So on a star rating, if we're going to start going to the star rating, I give it 5 out of 5. There's no criticisms, no complaints at all that I have about this movie.
I will give you the one legitimate thing I got mad about when I watched the movie, okay? Answer the fucking phone. It is so loud and jarring and annoying, and it happens over and over again, and I get it. It's needed to be there, so I'm not even like saying it's wrong that it's there. But that phone ringing, and it's those old school rotary style, horrible, annoying sounding phones, and it's constantly going, and I'm just like, just fucking answer the phone. And I was like legitimately getting angry at the movie for that, but I understand why it was there.
Who was calling, by the way? Was it Goss? Like, what's
don't know. You want to know what's funny? Okay, can I say something really, like, I'm gonna age myself hella right now. Okay, so I was watching an episode of Melrose Place that's very similar to this movie. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna go there. So there is a scene where Allison is getting stalked by someone who keeps calling her phone, and she starts blaming people at work. She starts getting these weird flowers and messages and stuff, and she's like trying to figure out who's doing this, and it turns out to be her angry ex who's doing it. And throughout that entire episode, the guy she is currently dating, Billy, was telling her this is very common behavior for exes to engage in. There's all these studies talking about it. And I don't know if you guys ever watch Aaron Spelling shows, but he's kind of a hit the nail on the head type of a person when he writes, when he gets the writers to do stuff. He's like, let's talk about AIDS and say AIDS 5,000 times in an episode. So I think they were actually legitimately trying to educate people about these kinds of toxic relationships. And I find it really funny that there was an episode of Melrose Place that was very similar to the movie Bug, but it even has some of the horror elements of it. But I feel like it was Goss, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just interjecting that in because I watched a Melrose Place episode. So
Goss is who Agnes thinks it is, but you know, if you take the conspiracy theory point of view of this film, that you know the government is after you, then it's possible that it's not. So,
but the phone calls were happening before Mr. Bug guy comes over, so it's hard to tell. I mean, she seemed to think it before she met Peter that it was Goss, because the phone calls didn't start happening until Goss left prison. But when she was going on her crazy rant, she believes that the government was behind it because RC purposely put Peter into her life. So that was how they filled in their plot hole that way. Who knows, right? I think that's what Antonio's trying to say, though. Like, it can be ambiguous, and that's kind of what makes this film so fucking interesting. We wouldn't be able to talk this long about it if it was obvious at the end, you know? So I think that's kind of what makes it beautiful, and I absolutely love this film. I will give it a 4.5 out of 5. I think it was absolutely interesting because real life is much scarier than the boogeyman. So I loved it, and it scared the crap out of me only because it's so realistic.
Yes, I just realized that I actually haven't given this film a rating yet, so I guess that's my turn. So I guess in addition to what I said previously about the film critically, the only other critique that I have to offer is that it's very tightly focused, but it's possibly too tightly focused. Honestly, this could have been a film that could have been 10, 12 minutes longer than it was and not lost anything in the inflation. You could, in particular, what I thought that there were a couple of moments where it seemed to me that Aggie's character accepted the kind of BS line that Peter was feeding her a little too unquestioningly. I think there could have been maybe 3 or 4 more scenes in there where she expresses even some sort of tentative and then he kind of pushes, as you see several other times in the movie, and then she goes okay. Just to develop the character a tiny bit better. That said, though, it's a tightly crafted movie. It's quite compelling, and one of the things that I come to a lot in this podcast is the question of, is a movie scary? And my answer is that I don't usually find movies scary. That I find movies unnerving or not. So as far as I wasn't scared at any point in this movie, obviously, but this is one of the most unnerving movies that I've seen. And it's because of the psychological realism of it, and also because the horror of it is not what people are experiencing externally, but the processes that are roiling inside of a person and careening him off a cliff. That is much more unnerving to me than, you know, some bear with antlers and a forked tail running out at you out of the woods and eating your child or whatever, you know, much, much less intimidating. So very, very freaky movie. I'm going to give this, I usually give it out of 10. I'll give it an 8 out of 10. Very compelling, very tightly crafted. I don't know how many rewatches it'll sustain, but as far as a first watch, just absolutely, I was like, holy shit, the whole movie, which I guess is that's a 5-star.
So
yeah, I just want to throw in there, I really think that the huge part about this film is that it seems like a drama for so fucking long, and it's so slow rolling, and you know it's building to something, and then it spirals so out of control that you're like, what the fuck am I even watching? And I think that's what gives it some staying power for me, where I would probably do some rewatches, because I'm gonna have to see when things spiral out of control again. I have to see if I can piece it together. I don't normally rewatch the movies that we do that I've never seen before, but I think this was one I will probably go back to, because what the fuck was happening in that movie? So
I think this is one of the most highly rated films that we've done on the podcast. If my memory serves, a couple other ones might be up there, that high Seventh Seal perhaps, but this is definitely a success for at least the four of us. Obviously, not everyone is here this evening, but that speaks pretty highly of the film. So one semi-closing thought, I suppose, is, Jim, this probably you might be more positioned to answer this, but if either of the other two of you have any thoughts, I don't know that I can think of any other horror plays. You know, I mean, like, I don't. Todd, I guess, is kind of a horror. But you know, there's plenty of horror movies, but there's not too many. As a genre, horror has not really found its home on the stage very much, and that's part of what makes this. Oh yeah, Little Shop of Horrors. That's
it's a little campy and musical, though. Like, this legit disturbed me, and that was one of the interesting things when I watched the movie. I was like, this feels like a play. This is very dialogue driven, and it's all secluded to one area, and there's hardly any actors. I feel like this is a play, and then I look it up and I'm like, okay, yeah, it was a play. So it makes sense. But how cool is that? And I would like to encourage anybody who makes plays or directs plays, please do more horror plays. I would go to all of them. I would go see every single one of them. That is fantastic. I didn't know it was a thing, and I'm super excited. So please do more.
Yeah, we're getting Jekyll and Hyde, the Woman in Black in the chat. Those, I think those qualify. One that popped into my head, it's one of your favorite plays too. It's by Martin McDonagh. Garrett, help me with the title.
Pillow Man.
Pillow Man, thank you. Yes,
that's another good, excellent horror play.
Yeah, but yeah, those, you're right that there are very few horror plays. And I think you have to go this route. I think you have to go psychological thriller. I mean, in many ways, I think Creep felt like plays. Creep and Creep 2. I think you could actually do those on the stage fairly easily.
Oh my gosh, are you going to do that? Please do that. Noah, make it happen. I know you're probably still watching, but I will say this. You guys said something interesting because you put this on as a play. You put out a scent of gasoline when they were going to set themselves on fire. How many elements of other sensory stuff did you implement in the play? I'm guessing you guys did the smells, you did the sounds. Like, how much did you guys go into it? Did you like ever adjust the temperature in the room to make it feel cooler at times? How far did you guys go in getting into the senses of the people when you performed this?
I asked if I could turn the air conditioning off, and they wouldn't let me. But I really wanted to. I wanted to turn the air conditioning off in the second act because the way the play is structured, it sort of starts off with the scene between Goss and Peter, and all of the flypaper is that's the start of the second act. And so I wanted to turn the air conditioning off between.
It's a claustrophobic movie, so that would actually make a whole hell of a lot of sense. I think they should have listened to you there. I think that would have been perfect.
I think they should have as well. And we also had the helicopters, and I turned the volume up to 11 on the helicopters, and we had sort of the music that goes along too. So. And we covered the entire set in foil and flypaper, and we had the bug zappers behind the audience, so that they were sort of immersed in it. It was sort of a thrust. We treated it as a false proscenium, but once the bug zappers came out, they were behind the audience, so you heard this constant buzzing during that last scene. And
that is fucking beautiful.
And there was thank you.
I love it. That is like, because that's the kind of thing I would try to do, is to try to make people feel uncomfortable, feel like, am I going crazy? What is reality? Yeah, that's beautiful.
I don't listen to audience reaction. Like I stay away from the lobby. But one of the things I've been told was that people were itching themselves during the production, and the other interesting.
That is such a huge compliment, dude. That is a huge compliment because that's what I was doing when I was watching the film as well. I kept like, do I have? And when they would twitch, I'd be like, oh, there's something in my hair. Ah. That's beautiful.
And yeah, the last thing is I turned all the lights off for the scene when Peter and Agnes wake up in bed. And so the only light in the entire room was the one that Peter was controlling. So the entire scene was lit by them positioning this one lamp by their faces. So there were no overhead lights during that scene except for one time when Agnes walks off and then I had to turn the lights up. But aside from that, it was just complete darkness except for this one light. So those were, that was it. But aside from that.
Shut up. You, hey, I'm going to rub your ego. That's fucking brilliant. And I think it's so cool. And yeah, I hope that you can meet up with Duplass and make Creep the play and yeah, make that happen. You guys should all tweet out that Jim here should do Creep the Play with Mark Duplass. He likes to do some weird, you know, random projects. That's like his MO, so let's make that happen. I want to see Jim make Creep.
All right. Okay. So I think we're about at 2 hours now. So why don't we head to wrap up? Does anyone have any sort of last thoughts or any other thing else that they want to throw in before we call it a day?
Good night, and don't let the bed bugs bite.
I think that's it. I think good night and don't let the bed bite. That's fantastic. All right.
Okay, that seems like a good note to end on. So I don't think we have another another film coming up on the schedule anytime soon, but hopefully we will get back into a more regular rhythm in the coming weeks. So if not necessarily next week, maybe the week after that, we'll put something else on the burner and hopefully have more thought-provoking conversation. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time, your attention, your thoughts, your opinions, and we'll catch you next time. Night, everybody.